those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button because we are just getting started.
All right. Looks like we are live, and I am excited. I know Matt's excited as well. We've got a lot of good people in the chat. It looks like a few of you noticed that we hit the 3,000 subscriber mark. So thank you, everybody, for all your support. Logical, plausible, probable. The Evolution Destroyer himself says SFT hits 3K subs, decides to issue a beat down on the YouTube Evos. Yes, they make it too easy, and it's too much fun. Isn't that right, Matt? It's too much fun just destroying these videos. And we just had a series of videos come out that's going to give us content for the next million years.
Yeah, that's right. I couldn't believe how many videos were made in the last couple of days. I mean, we didn't even know where to start.
No. So, you know, we thought we'd start with this one. This one's going to be a lot of fun, guys. We got some good content for you today. Some of it's going to be technical, but we're going to make sure that it is thorough. So, guys, once again, thanks for your support. Tuesday night, I'll probably do the 3,000 subscriber party, because Tuesday I've got a discussion / debate with an evolutionist named Top Dog at 8 o'clock. That's going to go for about an hour and a half, and then I'll probably open it up for an after party afterwards to celebrate. So, guys, thanks so much for the support. Announcement-wise, till we kick this off, we've got a few debates, interviews to really look forward to. On the 4th of February next month, we've got Michael Ord coming on, a well-known young Earth creation flood researcher. He's going to give us a great presentation on the stages of the flood, and then also focus on the recessive stage. So that's going to be awesome, followed by a Q&A. So we're probably going to have him here for a couple hours. So I've got a lot of his books. I've read a lot of his articles, papers. He answers everything, all your best critics, objections, and questions, guys. So make sure you're there with your best questions possible. A couple good debates we've got set up as well. We're going to be having, well, I'm close to confirming we should have Ken Hovind on next week for a debate. And we'll be having a debate on morality, another debate on morality between Matt Slick and Snake Was Right next week. So anyways, enough for me. Why don't we get right into this, Matt? What are we going to be doing tonight? Maybe introduce the video that we're going to be absolutely destroying, and then we'll kind of just get right into it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a good idea. Play the video as we can go through it. That way we don't just have to say what they're saying and repeat it. We can just play it and hit pause and go from there. That's probably the best.
And Matt, I know people in the chat are excited that you're back. I know you had a much-deserved vacation, so it's good to have you back. We got a lot of videos we're going to be refuting, including Simon Dan, which is...
Oh, I forgot about that.
Well, it's just, I mean, it's that bad. Things we've demolished over and over again. So we'll probably save that one for after these ones. Anyways, I'm going to share screen. We're going to get the audio going to make sure. Actually, okay. So before I do, I'll point out we're going to start this video at about the 6-minute mark, okay? Because the first bit of the video just goes through an introduction and an overview to the video. And guys in the chat, make sure audio is good too throughout this. Let me know. Dan, he goes into a couple Facebook messages he sent Dr. Jeanson in terms of having him on the channel. As we know, Answers in Genesis has a process when it comes to inviting Dr. Jeanson or any of their PhDs onto the channel. So, of course, a spur of the moment invite is not going to work. Dan could easily, at the end of the day, submit his criticisms and objections into the AIG journal for Dr. Jeanson to address. But I think we all know exactly why he won't, considering how easy it would be for Jeanson to dismantle all of his straw man arguments, and misrepresentations, as Raw, Matt, and myself have already shown over and over again, and you're going to see it clearly tonight. And you're really going to notice too, and why, you know, he would never submit to the AIG journal, is the fact that Dan has never once actually made a prediction of his own when attempting to complain about Jeanson's work, which is funny and telling. So we're going to start the video at about the 6-minute mark, okay, where they actually begin getting into their arguments and the topic, and then I'll even make sure to reiterate some of Dan's points on pedigrees and substitution rates and divergence calculations, just so everybody is following along. So, okay, here we go. I'm going to share screen, share audio. And Matt, I'll mute myself so there's no echo during this, and I'll stop it every couple of minutes. So here we go.
Just very briefly, what Jeanson claims is, and this is the post, a young Earth creation, human mitochondrial DNA clock, whole mitochondrial genome mutation rate confirms D-loop results. He calculates a most recent common ancestor, that is the convergence point in the past, at about 6,000 years ago. And he does this using a thing called the pedigree mutation rate. Now, pedigree mutation rate is when you look at parents and offspring, and you look at the differences between them. That's a pedigree mutation rate. Like a pedigree is, you got grandma and grandpa, and you got the parents, and then you got the grandkids, right? That's, you look at the different, you can track like genetic disorders through a pedigree. So he uses this generation over generation mutation rate. How many changes, how many differences are there per generation? And then, extrapolate that backwards, and you get your time to most recent common ancestor based on how many differences there are. Now, the data he uses, I say Jeanson's data because he didn't collect the data. He's using data from other studies, and he referenced 3 studies, but he actually only really referenced 1, because as you can see right here, the mutations he looked at, 2 of the studies had 0. One of them, Ding 2015, had 63, and those are the mutations that we're dealing with right here. Okay, so these 63 mutations in these pedigrees, these parent-offspring surveys, were the basis for Jeanson's conclusion. So those are the data that he's using. He's looking at parents and offspring and the number of differences. And the one that he's using documented 63 specific mutations. Okay? Now, the way you calculate, don't worry, Neff, it's right after this, then we're going to you with all the stuff that you have lined up, because just wait, everybody. So the way you calculate the time to most recent common ancestor, and that's what this is, TMRCA, time to most recent common ancestor. What you do is you determine the long-term mutation rate based on known divergence times. So like for viruses, which is what I'm familiar with, like really familiar with, is like we know when a specific virus jumped into a new host, right? Because we know when this disease emerged. Okay, so now we can use that as the known divergence time, and we could look over tens of thousands of generations, which may only be a few decades for viruses, how many substitutions accumulate in that lineage. And then we could look at the most divergent samples for that group of viruses overall. Take the 2 most divergent ones and say, okay, given that rate that we've observed, let's see how long it would take to accumulate all of those differences. Now, it's more complicated than that because you have to deal with things like population size and stuff. It gets more complicated, but that's the idea. You document the long-term rate based on a known divergence event, and then you apply that rate to the largest number of differences you can find within your sample group to work backwards to see where the time to most recent common ancestor falls for that group. That's what we're basically doing here. Now, Jeanson doesn't do this. There's so many things wrong with what Jeanson actually does. As David said earlier, every time you look at this paper, it just gets worse and worse. And it's not even a long paper. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to David Neff. And David, you're probably going to want to share your screen. So I'm going to stop mine and take whatever time you want, go through the various problems that you have accumulated with this paper. Then I'll talk about my favorite problems with this paper. And then we'll talk about the new stuff that, even if you put all that stuff aside, it still invalidates this paper. If you assume nothing that anyone has ever said about this paper is wrong, if you assume all that stuff, my criticisms, everything's wrong, we're going to talk about why it's still wrong. So if you want to share your screen.
Yeah.
All right, Matt, I'm going to reiterate a couple things that Dan explained here, and then we'll go into anything that you'd want to discuss specifically on that portion. But I know the major arguments come after this with what David Neff iterates. But I want to point out to the audience and make sure my audio is good too. But people don't realize it, okay? And I show a paper over and over again about the Eve mitochondrial DNA consensus sequence, okay? The fact is, we actually know Eve, okay? There is no debate here. We know her sequence, okay? It's been published. And the critics don't want to read the papers that we cite in support of our position, okay? Well, I'm going to explain then in a nutshell, okay, how we know her sequence. Okay, mitochondrial DNA, being the uniparentally inherited DNA, is only about 16,000 letters long. Okay, so all we have to do is take all the mitochondrial DNA in the world. Okay, we can line them up, and when we line them up, what we realize, okay, we understand that 85% of the letters out of these roughly 16,000 letters, it turns out that everybody has exactly the same letter, okay? So if you're following, that would mean Eve had that letter, right? Now, if we look to the places that had variability, okay, we want to look to the variable places, of course, in the mitochondrial DNA. What we're going to notice is that, let's say everybody in the world has an A, but then one person has a T. Okay. Well, logically, what did Eve then have? Well, most likely an A. And we can then apply this logic. Okay. And as an outcome, as a result, we understand that we actually have the Eve consensus sequence. And this is the type of information that we can then look at to realize that overall, we're only a few mutations removed. Anybody on this planet, only a few mutations removed from the Eve consensus sequence. Extremely, extremely low variability in the mitochondrial DNA, okay? And the critics never address this as to why, okay? And we're going to go over their arguments later as to some of their rescue devices, but I wanted to make that clear, at least for the audience, okay? But to reiterate some of Dan, some of his points here, he's going over the pedigree rate, okay? And the pedigree rate is essentially, okay, is when you look at parents and offspring, and then all you have to do is look at the differences between them. It really is that simple, okay? This is the pedigree rate that we love. We get grandparents, as Dan iterated, parents and grandchildren. Then we can track genetic mutations through this pedigree process. And essentially, we can determine how many genetic changes, how many mutations there are within this generation, okay, by doing this generation to generation analysis. Then, as Dan iterated, we can extrapolate backwards, where we then get to a time to most recent common ancestor based on those differences, okay, that exist. Then Dan goes on to talk about what the best way to determine a long-term mutation rate, okay, which, as he states, should be done through divergence times. And then he uses viruses as an example, okay? Since we know when a virus jumps into a new host, because we know when this disease emerged, and so obviously as a result, we can use that as a known divergence time, okay? Then we can look over tens of thousands of generations, which may only be a few decades in terms of viruses. Then we can determine how many differences have accumulated in that lineage, and then we can look at the most divergent samples for that group of viruses overall, okay? And if you're listening to Dan there, what he does is he explains that we can take the two most divergent ones, and then given the rate being observed, let's take that and see how long essentially it would take to accumulate all of these differences. So it's that simple, really. And the first thing I thought, though, when I was listening to Dan explaining this, by the way, explaining things that we are all well aware of, right? The basics, things that Dr. Jeanson is well aware of, okay? These explanations don't get us anywhere close to debunking anything coming from young Earth creationists such as Dr. Jeanson, Carter, Sanford. These are all well-known scientific principles that Jeanson is aware of when it comes to pedigrees, divergence time, substitution rates. But I will say, I'm glad, credit where credit is due. I'm glad Dan covers it, though, in order that everybody can follow along in this debate, okay? But as Dan admits there at the end, this is all oversimplification because there are many, many assumptions, okay? That's key to understand. Many assumptions. Sometimes these assumptions are unknowable. which result in them being pure guesses, especially when it comes to the divergence times that he's talking about. For example, the so-called prediction he made months and months ago, that Matt and I did a couple-hour video on, if you remember that, Matt, had built-in assumptions. We read the paper, had built-in assumptions when it comes to population sizes, okay, assumptions on evolution in general, just to name a couple. And therefore, determining a long-term rate or a substitution rate, okay, based on a known divergence event in history, and then you apply that rate to the largest number of differences that you can find within your sample group, essentially, in order to work our way backwards, which then allows us to see where the time to most recent ancestor falls within that group. I'll say this last thing, because I do like that he looked to viruses, okay? Because in virology, the substitution rate can be a little more relevant given Dan's explanation here. I'm going to use HIV as an example. Okay, let us say it mutates every viral generation, let's say. Well, this per generation rate happens inside a single individual, of course. Now, which particular mutations get transferred to the next person upon infection gets a little more messier, hence the substitution rate. And Dan, he's hoping that something similar to this applies to the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome. And you will notice, and we're going to touch on this, and Ram, Matt, and I were discussing this as well, how we notice that all these critics, they have different rescue mechanisms and different explanations. Sometimes what they do is they chalk it up to a discrepancy in natural selection, okay? They'll chalk that discrepancy up to natural selection. And other times they invoke something else, such as substitution rates. But once again, I need to point out, if it does not lead, if it does not make testable predictions, then it's just another form of pseudoscience. Hence why we call Dan the pseudoscience man. It's fitting. But the funny thing about all of this is the fact that this is the standard when it comes to testability, predictability. This is the standard that the evolutionists themselves have erected. So I just wanted to reiterate those points, show you how we all understand, okay, the science of substitution rates, divergence rates, pedigrees. Okay, we also understand the assumptions that they make, the evolutionists make, on known historical events when it comes to a divergence time, when it comes to population sizes, population history. And if the explanations or the rescue mechanisms are not leading to testable predictions, then it's just another form of pseudoscience. Matt, what are your thoughts, brother?
Yeah, you made one mistake there. It's Dr. Raw Matt.
Yeah, my bad. I apologize, sir. It'll never happen again.
My doctor in divinity really pushed me up the charts in hate. I noticed
right,
that.
Right.
I guess we'll continue to use that.
Any publicity is good publicity, brother.
Yeah, that's for sure, man. Yeah, let's jump into it, man. Those were good points, especially when it comes to the assumptions of population sizes as well. We don't know the inference of the population size in the past when we go back, so it's inferred, and that really makes a huge difference when you get into bootstrapping, which is basically the simulation to show what the outcome is going to be. So it can't just throw in numbers based on an assumption. But
well, and it shows too. And I know a lot of that was technical heavy, maybe for the audience. It was a little bit boring, but I want to make it clear that we all understand these things. Okay. Matt understands it. I understand it. Obviously Dr. Jeanson understands it. You know, the argument doesn't really begin until we've acknowledged these important aspects of this debate. Right. And real quick, I'll say this, and then I'm going to yield, or we'll go to the next part. And then I know you got some things to say. But this is why Dan, okay, is absolutely terrified of the Y chromosome findings. Right, Matt? Which turns out to be even a stronger case than the mitochondrial DNA, which, by the way, Dan attempted to do damage control for. He attempted to do it for Erica. And I had such an amazing time responding to that absolute train wreck. So, yeah, Let's go on to the next part. We'll let David kind of say his piece. And then I know you got some good stuff for us on that. So I'll mute myself again, share screen, and we're gonna get into the fun stuff now. Now that we've established the basics of it, let's get into it.
I'll share my screen in a minute, but I want to begin with a very simple observation, and that is that multiple independent teams of scientists have worked on the problem of calculating the time to the most recent common ancestor, and Dr. Jeanson is the only person to get the result that he did. So the fact is, nobody has been able to replicate his results. And as anyone who is familiar with science should know, if your results cannot be replicated, then that is pretty much an alarm bell saying, "Hey, my results are probably wrong." Dr. Dan, what is the largest class that you have? What is your largest class?
Largest class that I teach?
Yeah.
Toss it up. All right. So let's see if Jeanson really is an outlier. Okay. I'm going to share. I don't know if you can see that, so I'll assume you will. And
yes, I can see it.
Okay, good. So here's a question for David then. Is what you're looking at the top are different pedigree studies with the dates they were there. And we find Jeanson is at the bottom, okay? So if Jeanson obtained 6,000 years with a pedigree rate, which you can see here, he deemed from that, mostly that one study. And we can see that Hal in 1996 found one mutation every 25 generations. Of course, he came back years later and found one out of 44. And then in, I think, 2003, he pulled all the data together and got a different rate, but that's besides the fact. And then here we get Parsons at 1 out of 33 generations, which came to about 6,000 years. And then he ran it again the next year, obtained 1 out of 30 generations. And then more recently, Christina Santos here, they found one mutation every 29 generations, but they assumed this can't obviously be true. So they removed about half of them and just said they must be substitutions. They couldn't tell. They didn't know, so they just threw it out. And then in 2012, much more recent, look, they got just as high as Parsons as well. So how can you say Jeanson is the only outlier when multiple studies actually do agree with what he came out with? So it doesn't seem as though he's really that much of an outlier, right? When other studies are getting in conjunction with what he found as results. So clearly he's not that much of an outlier. So here's another question as well. If Santos removed what she thought were somatic mutations, and Parson comes along and says, well, let's see that real quick. Hold on, I'm gonna add a image. And this is what he had to say regarding heteroplasmy and substitutions right here. The somatic variants, which a lot of people think are in studies that they neglect, he actually shows that they are able to detect them in multiple families. Therefore, they can't be somatic. So a lot of these studies just go, those are probably somatic, so we won't count them. Remember, they only recently are able to determine and distinguish between some of these somatic mutations. So a lot of studies, especially the earlier ones, they just didn't know. But now we can start to tell a little bit. And look at this. This is Parsons years ago was able to distinguish the difference between them. So Parsons was able to differentiate them and remove them. And yet he get the exact same rate as Dr. Jeanson here. So I was just curious as why, when you look at the overall, you can see on the right-hand side, they line up. There's a lot of studies that show that they're in conjunction with one another. And here was one of here's what they actually said about this. This is a long time ago too, by the way, that they go, people lived about 100,000 to 200,000 years ago in Africa, but using the new rate, she's just around 6,000 years ago. This is back in the 90s. They go, no one thinks that's the case. But notice at the end, it says, I'm worried. Well, why would they be worried? I thought they were confident. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think it's hilarious. It reminds me of the lack of response by the critics such as CRISPR to Parsons, and the response we received from Parsons, as in he's dealt with all the criticisms. Okay. If he's so wrong, then apparently, people have been falsely incriminated over the years, right? Because the mutation rate is good enough for the FBI, apparently not good enough for the critics. And if he were to run it again, what did he say, Matt?
He would land on the same results even today.
He's playing on the same results. So he challenged them, which he'll never get. Just like Jeanson will never get. He challenged them to submit their own peer-reviewed work and actually challenge what he has done. It just shows how biased these are, because Parsons is not publishing in a technical journal. From my understanding, he's not even a young Earth creationist. But yet they'll still attack him because it goes against their evolutionary story, right? So it doesn't matter who it is, creationists, evolutionists, if they're going against or they're saying something that's anti-Pawns Come to People evolution, then that's it. They're triggered, right?
Yeah, that's it. No alternative. No alternative. These numbers have to be wrong because they have to be. There's no way that they could be this young, even though they empirically show that, and that's the rate they use. Can't be right. There's got to be something going on. So remember, that's when they first came out with heteroplasmy. This must be the case. And then that sped the rate up. So it made it worse. So they're like, okay, well, we'll ignore that. We'll come up with something else. We'll say selection removes it, but we'll get into all this.
Well, and I'll point that out too, is, for example, CRISPR in his response with Erica. Okay, what I'm about to say is it's been pointed out, this argument, okay, by all of these critics, essentially. CRISPR, Dodgeball Dan, Evograd, they've all pointed out that by definition, okay, as if this is news to anybody, by definition, the fast mutation rate that we get from these pedigree studies, Matt, obviously means that the overall mutation rate, the long-term mutation rate, let's say after many, many, many generations, is then going to be slower. Since selection is a real thing, and selection by definition will weed out some of these mutations over time, right? A lot of these mutations will be lost, of course. New variants oftentimes are just lost due to drift. We all agree on this. Once again, these are the basics. This is kind of like arguing with an evolutionist on genetic entropy. Okay, everybody, including the creationists and the evolutionists, first needs to acknowledge the existence of what? Well, the existence of the roles for natural selection, mutations, adaptation. And not until both sides can agree on these basic principles can we actually begin the debate. Okay, CRISPR and Evograd and Dan, they're saying things as if we already didn't know or Jeanson did not consider. I'll say this and I'll yield. The major point behind these arguments, behind these points that we've been discussing, okay, is that when we look to the macro scale, the macro view of things, okay, let's say behind the pedigree rate studies, yes, selection weeds out mutations, okay, but in order for selection to be invoked in terms of solving this problem and dilemma for the evolutionists, okay, for one, as we've said over and over again, testable predictions need to be made, and they have not been made. But most importantly, we have considered purifying selection, okay, substitution rates, genetic drift, the bottlenecks they talk about. These have all been considered. We allow for huge amounts of purifying selection based on these faster mutation rates. And yet, the amount of mutations that we actually see in the mitochondrial DNA, the Y chromosome, they're far too few for deep time evolution. And that's why I spent the first little bit discussing how we know Eve. We literally have her sequence and we're only a few mutations removed, nowhere near where the evolutionist needs Eve to be. So then what do, Matt? They invoke or they invent these fancy stories to account for why there are so few mutations. They can't make predictions, while Jeanson has made predictions on the stamp of civilization, which they can't understand for the life of them, which is why they never comment on it. But the predictions are working so well. And their argument is, well, Jeanson's lying. Well, that's not an argument. They're invoking a conspiracy, that Jeanson has some conspiracy with his active research program, okay, where the predictions are working, they're flowing beautifully, and they're just saying, no, Jeanson's lying. But not to mention the fact that mitochondrial DNA worldwide and Y chromosome DNA worldwide are incredibly similar. Very, very low genetic variation indicates we've descended from two common ancestors just thousands of years ago, not hundreds of thousands of years ago. And this is accounting for, and I can't emphasize this enough, and then I'll yield. This is accounting for the factors that they use and put forth as arguments: substitution rates, bottlenecks, genetic drift, so on and so forth. We understand by definition, yes, the rate we observe today, the long-term rate is obviously going to be slower than that because some of the mutations will be weeded out. If these critics have ever read the work of Carter, Sanford, Jeanson, okay, I've got an article here that I document in my book, Special Creation. I cite it heavily, where Carter and Sanford point out the fact that they have allowed for the necessary purifying selection, and we're still only a few hundred generations away from Eve, a few hundred generations away from Y chromosome Noah. I mean, that's it. They're done. You know what I mean? So those are just my thoughts on that. Go ahead, Matt, whatever you want to say, and then I can continue the video.
Sure. So when we were looking at those different mutation rate studies, and we show how the mutation rate is clearly right around what Jeanson discovered, if David is uncomfortable with the results that he got, which are, let's say, off by 500 years, or let's say 1,000 years or 1,500 years, that's okay. But why is this a big problem when your model has discrepancies in it with the phylogeny that are hundreds of thousands of years, right? You're pointing at us. They're like, oh, that's ridiculous. He's 500 years off where he needs to be. It's like, wait a minute. Your phylogeny rates have everything from like 70,000 years up to 400,000 years, and that's not a problem.
Right.
We're not.
I talked to one of these critics, and I said, "Okay, the worst date that you'll get from these pedigree studies, right? Because no one's expecting all of them to just go right back to 6,000 years, right? That would be a straw man. The fact is, the window of dates we get, whether it's 6,000, 12,000, okay, 15,000, it's all in line with young Earth creation dates, but nowhere near the date necessary for deep time evolution and the human evolution story. And I've spoken to a lot of these critics. One of them I spoke to, and you should have seen the story. You should have seen the imagination flowing. Well, maybe this, maybe that, maybe a little of this, sprinkle on a little of this, and we'll get our date to, a couple 100,000 years old. It's pseudoscience is what it is, Matt.
Oh man, yeah, you've heard it all by now, though. You've been doing this 2 years, so.
Yeah. So did you want me to play more of the video?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
Is almost 500 people. Largest class I teach gets about 480 people every fall.
Okay, so let's just round that number up to 500. If you were to give a test, there are 500 ways for the class to get a question wrong, but only one way to get the question right. If 499 people came up with one answer and one person came up with the other answer, there's a very good chance that the one person is incorrect, and the majority of the class is. And that's one of the things that I want to demonstrate is that all of the other, if we were to plot out do like a data plot of all the studies that have done DNA and figure out, okay, we're going to do a data plot of where they fall. Dr. Jeanson would be the obvious outlier in that study.
Yep. So it'll be Jeanson over here, and then everybody else will be over here somewhere. There'll be a big distribution over here, and then Jeanson all the way down here, smushed in by 0.
Yep. And that is basically how we would look at it when we were to do a data plot, if we were to do what's called a meta-analysis of the studies that have done this work. And that is where, when you actually, and the thing I love about meta-analysis like this is that is when you really start to find, okay, maybe there's an error in this paper over here when you compare that to all the other papers that have been published on that topic. Second problem that I see is that Jeanson's sample size is way too small. In the Dana paper, they used only 333 pedigrees. The others were 26, and the other one was 39, so that's a total of 398 pedigrees. Of that total, 6,594,462 base pairs were examined, and only 63 of the homoplastic mutants were detected. So I'm going to share my screen here.
Okay, pause it. What in the
data here? And if you look at the ethnicity, we see Dana.
What in the world is he talking about? That's a lot of people. That's a huge pedigree study, actually.
Right.
I mean, I can share it again real quick. look at the number on the bottom for Jeanson's down there. I mean, I look at Parsons. Parsons was one of the largest ever to date up until recently. And look at the numbers for him. Huge amounts of families, huge database. He tested, in his first study in 1997, he tested 167 independent mtDNA lineages, 33 from Sweden, 73 from mixed ancestry, 5 from England, 40 Amish people, 16 from Utah. This was huge, right? Mega database, all from the FBI, right? That's why he had his hands on so many different blood samples. And then Jeanson comes along and he uses this study, 333. I don't know why that's not big enough. I mean, it's like literally one of the largest studies I've ever seen, ever. But I digress. I don't know what would be a good number. I guess the question would be for David, what would be a good amount of number of families for a good pedigree rate study to be consistently good?
Right. Good question.
Don't know. Okay, there we go.
Okay. Want me to keep it going, brother?
Yeah.
Danish, Finnish, European, and Sardinian. So the whole entire data is pretty much centered around the European ethnicities. This is simply not enough data. And the kicker is Dr. Jeanson knows this. How do I know he knows this? Because he later says the following, if I can find it.
There, I think it's that paragraph right there, conversely.
Yeah, here we go. Conversely, since certain African groups are more genetically diverse than non-African groups, it remains to be seen whether the result in this study will hold true in the African groups as well. Now let's stop here for a moment and let's use our brains. Why didn't Dr. Jeanson include African DNA in this study? If he is basically openly admitting that we don't know what his results are going to be holding true, if we include this analysis, then why didn't he include African DNA? I asked Dr. Jeanson this, and he did not answer me.
Okay,
can I just jump in for one information here?
Oh yeah, go right ahead.
If I'm reviewing a paper, and I've reviewed papers as part of the peer review process, if I'm
the reason Jeanson didn't do it is because it hasn't been done. They haven't really tested African people groups. So that's pretty much why he hasn't done it. But that's, again, why he made a prediction on it. I don't know, why that's bad. But let's say, okay, Europeans are what we have. And that's what we tested. And he got a mutation rate that's around, 6,000 years. Jeanson admitted that he had trouble with this because capturing all the genetic diversity, he had to reduce the generation time to 15 years to do that. So he predicted that, well, maybe Africans just mutate faster. So therefore, because they haven't really been tested yet, he said, I bet you when they do, they're going to mutate faster because they have faster generational times. That was his prediction on it. And so David comes along and says, well, I don't know why he doesn't show African generation or mutation rates. It's because he just doesn't have them yet. Nobody does.
Right. And one point I was thinking about earlier, when it comes to Parsons, Howell, and the other, a lot of other mutation rate studies that we document in our mutation rate book, an entire book on this, they took somatic mutations into consideration and excluded them from their pedigree studies. Isn't that right?
Yeah, they really, I mean, Parsons went back to go look at his old work too, remember? Because he needs to be accurate, because if you're not, you're gonna go to jail. So he really wanted to make sure that he's not counting somatic mutations as well. And he says, it's pretty easy to determine they are. You just need a big sample size, because the smaller the sample size, the less you see. So you end up counting things that that probably shouldn't be. But when you stand back and look at the bigger picture, you can tell somatic mutations build up more later in age anyway. So it's good to have a massive diversity of young people, older people, and then you can really distinguish what'll be somatic and whatnot. And go ahead.
No, yeah, I want to point this out too, because here's Dan's argument, okay? Because Dan is not very good at this at all, as has been shown, right? Which is why he makes this so easy. So I wasn't going to show this, at least just yet, but I want to put this to bed over and over again, because oftentimes he'll wave all these away. I don't care. Okay, maybe they did consider somatic cell line mutations, and sure, he's admitted to me in debates and discussions, especially in after shows, that yes, the mutation rate in the mitochondrial DNA is fast, a lot faster than ever expected, but it's all about the long-term mutation rate. It's all about the fact that selection is going to weed out a lot of these changes, a lot of these differences over time. Therefore, we need to look to the substitution rate, right? So I want to put that to bed by going over to, once again, where they don't ever want to focus on. I got a million slides here, so it takes me forever to find them these days. Here we go. So I want to read, actually, from my book, I document page 13 on special creation. Okay, I document Dr. Rob Carter and Dr. John Sanford, who did a study on this. They point out evolutionists now regret having coined the term mitochondrial Eve, which was meant to be a tongue-in-cheek slap at the biblical perspective. But now both sides agree that there is but one mother of us all. In fact, we have statistically analyzed over 800, over 800 human mitochondrial DNA sequences. And they've been able to reconstruct. As we started this off with, I explained how that's possible and how simple it really is, right? So they've been able to reconstruct and publish. And one thing, Dr. Carter, and I'm not quoting him, where Dr. Carter is published on mitochondrial DNA in a secular journal. I'd like to see Dan's publication on mitochondrial DNA in a secular journal, okay? I don't think it exists. So they point out that they have a very, very, very close approximation of Eve's mitochondrial sequence. We know Eve, essentially. Here's what they found. And this is a reflection on this tree. This is the bigger picture, okay? Yeah, sure. Let's acknowledge the fact that the observed pedigree rate that is fast, yes, selection is going to weed some of those mutations out. We've allowed for purifying selection. We've accounted for all of these factors, okay? So they've discovered, okay, that the average human being is only about 22. Think about that. Only 22 mutations removed from the Eve sequence. Okay. And the maximum individuals are about 100 mutations removed from Eve, right? Those in Africa, okay, that they want to complain about. So they continue. I'm gonna go to the next page here. Can we account for this amount of mutation in a biblical time frame? Easily. The most recent estimate of the mutation rate in human mitochondria is 0.5 per generation. Thus, even for the most mutated sequences, okay, like these African lines that David here is saying is a problem, it would only require 200 generations. That's less than 6,000 years to accumulate 100 mutations, okay? And here's the thing, if mutation rates were even faster in the past for the number of factors that we've discussed, then that makes it even easier for us, right? Especially with our bottlenecks, rapid fixation, rapid substitution rates, as you point out. And this all allows for a substantial amount of purifying selection, okay? It accounts for your bottlenecks. It accounts for, we love our bottlenecks in our model. It helps it even more. So here's the point. This is a reflection of those DNA differences. This is the macro view. What do we see, okay? We see a pattern, explosive growth from a center point, right? Just as our bottleneck in the biblical model would suggest, we start with Eve, right? And what follows? Rapid and exponential population growth. And what's nice is, okay, this is free from bias essentially, because this right here is an unrooted tree, which allows for a natural reading of the data, of the DNA differences. Then Dan, because he's so biased, doesn't even want to agree on the basics, which means we can't even get into the bulk of the conversation that's important, because he wants to argue about the minutia that there's nothing to argue about. When it comes to the rooted trees, okay, when it comes to evolutionary assumptions, wow, the molecular clock is broken for one, because we point out over and over again the different lengths in these branches and in these haplogroups. HVR, for example, we point out, if people are picking up more mutations in the exact same amount of time, these are all connected to a common ancestor. Okay, if you can pick up more mutations in the exact same amount of time than say your cousins, okay, then you can't really make assumptions about like the human and chimp split, okay, and look to the DNA differences that separate humans and chimps, and therefore come to a mutation rate that is extremely slow, essentially, when you make those assumptions. But here's the thing, even if you were to root it on evolutionary assumptions, Matt, does that change the data? No, it doesn't change the number of mutations. It doesn't change the analysis, doesn't change any of that. And that's what's important to consider, is the fact that there's only a few mutations here. That's it. There's only a few easily accounted for in our model. And this is when we account for the substitution rates, the long-term mutation rate. Okay, bottlenecks. Matt, can you briefly explain our bottlenecks? We have our bottlenecks, and what happens during those bottlenecks?
Mitochondrial diversities reset.
Right, and what happens with the rapid fixation? I mean, what's going to happen in those few generations, let's say at the flood bottleneck?
Oh, good question. I will show people what they say themselves. Hold on. 3, 2, 1, boom. Smaller populations have higher fixation rates.
Boom, boom. That's it. How easy is it for us to account for the number of mutations on that tree? That's why, for example, I was debating Walker on Modern Day Debate, and it was a blast because I got to debunk all of Team Dodgeball through Walker. I mean, we got into TMR4A, we got into phylogenetics, PRDM9. He was baffled, no answer. You know, they never have an answer. Here's the graph, here's a reflection, here's the macro picture. There's only a few mutations. That's it. A few mutations removed from the Eve consensus sequence. And what you just said, small populations, right? That rapid fixation after the flood brings us right back to the biblical date, right? Because oftentimes they'll point to, like CRISPR, right? It'll point to some studies that attained a pedigree rate or a pedigree date, a date for the most recent common ancestor of like 15,000 years or something, right, Matt? But then they're not considering those bottlenecks, isn't that right?
Right, because remember, they're seeing the 24 fixed substitutions in all of humanity, and they go, well, yeah, that's not very many, but you got to remember, the population over millions of years has never dropped below like 10,000, right? So that's their rescue for why there's so few, but yet at the same time, why it can go back over millions of years. But here's the problem with that. They have a lot of bottlenecks in their theory, and these bottlenecks don't last a couple generations like ours does. They last for thousands and thousands of years, and these small populations stay small throughout that entire time. So why in the world would there be multiple bottlenecks that last for thousands of years, multiple different times in the past of history, and still we only have 24 fixed in all of humanity? Doesn't sound too good, you know?
Well, and that's why it's hilarious, because when they even bring up their bottlenecks or look to their out of Africa scenario or coalescence, they say it should be expected. I'm going to read this one last thing and then I'll yield. We'll go to the next part of the video unless you have something else to say, okay? But I document in my book, Special Creation, page 16. Okay, Dr. Sanford and Dr. Carter laugh at these arguments from, Swamidas, strawman Swamidas. So they say, given the biblical perspective, a singular highly conserved, because that's what we have, right? Exactly what we expected based on the biblical model. A highly conserved mitochondrial Eve sequence is exactly what we would be expected according to our model. But a very clear mother of us all is not a reasonable explanation given the evolutionary perspective. Okay, so think about this, Matt. In fact, given reasonable evolutionary assumptions, there should be many ancient mitochondrial types. This is why, Matt, they never predicted any of this. They had to force fit the data into their story instead of tapping out. Okay, so the data suggests that there should be many ancient mitochondrial types. It is claimed that humanity first came out of Africa over 1 million years ago and diverged into Homo erectus populations in Africa, Europe, Asia, and Australia. So if you're following in the audience, what is this going to mean? Well, over this much time, each continent would have its own distinctive mitochondrial sequence. When Homo sapiens emerged out of Africa and mated with Homo erectus derivatives, right, such as Neanderthalensis, Denisovans, the human race should have had enormous mitochondrial diversity with no clearly discernible beginning sequence. Even with their rescue devices, it doesn't work. And then coalescence, as we know, assumes random mating, and historically, obviously, people have broken off into into tribes, for example, and married within those tribes. But that's what's hilarious, and that's why their story is so ridiculous. That's why they didn't predict the low genetic diversity. David here was in the chat. We've had some great debates. Okay, but we've debated all these topics. We debated this topic for 2 hours, and he never has an answer. One time he said he's going to make a video on it. The fact that we have low genetic diversity, which is exactly what we'd expect from a starting position of 2. Okay, we're all 99.99% similar. The evolutionary story says we've been evolving for millions and millions of years, from the Australopithecines, right, up to habilis, into erectus, who's evolving for 1 million years, okay, over the globe, generating every single generation more mutations, more genetic diversity, adding more genetic diversity to the population. Therefore, we should expect humans today would have high levels of genetic diversity. But no, that's not what we found. So they invented their out of Africa population bottlenecks, as I should say, Matt, as you pointed out, which have their own massive number of problems associated with it. But even when they invoke that rescue device, it still doesn't work. It still doesn't work. So it's just hilarious how defeated they are. And you can see it in these videos, how they never address the problems. They straw man, they misrepresent, they never address the bigger picture. Dan repeats. He's got a lot of invested, right? This is his livelihood, his career, but he repeats the same talking points over and over again that have been considered, and they don't work. Dodgeball Dan, they don't work. It's time to admit to me. I predict he's already admitted defeat in his head, right? He deceives himself, just like in the Bible, right? We deceive ourselves. But we're not deceiving those around us. We can all see how utterly defeated Team Dodgeball is. Okay, and they know it deep down inside, but they're deceiving themselves. They're not deceiving others. So sorry about that diatribe. Go ahead, Matt.
Oh, nothing. I just threw up while you were talking about how they invoked this global catastrophe about 200,000 years ago that reset all the mitochondria, but yet they can't even find it in their own fossil record. So we have the genetic evidence that tells us that mitochondria was reset in the past. And yet for it to match their model, they need some kind of physical evidence, but they can't find any, which is pretty ironic. But we can move on.
Yes, let's move on. But before we move on, dodge, duck, dip, dive, and dodge. And there was a lot of that going on in Erica's latest couple of videos. So we're going to have a lot of fun with that. If you haven't seen our post debunking Diaper Dino, I mean, he's the bench warmer, the water boy of Team Dodgeball. So he doesn't really deserve a lot of time. He doesn't have any good arguments, focuses on low quality, low confidence science, doesn't understand the genetics, and does nothing to counter the evidence confirming independent origins. But he's sometimes fun to, refute. He doesn't have much to refute. So yeah. Anyways, let's share screen here and get back to the fun, right, Matt?
I'm reviewing a paper, and the author says, now we have a conundrum here. We don't know if it's A or B, and there's a simple way to test that. What I'm going to write back is like, you should not leave that hanging, and you should not just assume it's one or the other. You should test that, because we have the data to do that. So like, you should look into that and either find a reference that has done that, or collect the data and do the calculations yourself. That's the obvious thing to do right there. Hey, I've got a question. I don't know which one it is. Like, okay, Dr. Scientist from Harvard, like, do the science, figure it out. That's just like, do it.
Yeah, exactly. And let's go on, just so I won't be accused from stating the truth with quote mining. I'm going to read what he says after that. 2 major hypotheses exist for the increased mtDNA diversity in Africans. Either they originated first, or they mutated their mtDNA slightly faster than non-Africans. So let's digest this information real quick. There is something called the Felder effect. And if you were to take a look at the human population and figure out, okay, Africans have the most genetic diversity, we can predict based on that alone that humans originated in Africa. Because when you have a parent population and then you have a small population that goes off somewhere else, that small population is losing the genetic diversity from the parent group, and so they are going to be less diverse genetically. If I can do an analogy real quick, imagine that we establish a colony on the moon. And then from there, the people on the moon, a small portion of them, establish another colony on Mars. If we were to do a genetic analysis, by understanding the founder effect, Earth would have the most genetic diversity, followed by the Moon, and followed by Mars. This really is not that difficult. The second thing is that they mutated their mtDNA slightly faster than non-Africans. The problem here is that there's simply no evidence that they mutated their DNA faster. Moreover, there's no mechanism by which they can speed up or slow down in this group, but not over here in another group. But let's continue. The evolutionary out of African model naturally holds the first explanation.
There was a lot there. So we can well, the first thing he said was that we can know that we came from out of Africa because there's higher diversity there. This shows that he doesn't grasp why a faster mutation rate in Africans would result in them being the same age as the rest of humanity. This shows that he's not understanding what Jeanson is talking about when he's trying to make this prediction saying that we mutate faster. I know he just said that there's no way we've ever changed the mutation rate, but we'll get in a minute. Erica had this same problem with me. So I'm going to give you guys an example. Let's use the bottleneck, okay? So here's some cats, right? They all have a different mitochondrial clock. That's what we say. But why? Okay, let's say that this bottleneck was the global flood. It's the door. Out walks all four of these at the exact same time: a human, a chimpanzee, a gorilla, and an orangutan. Which one of these would be older after 150 years if you were to test them genetically? Well, according to evolution, they would be mutating at exactly the same rate. This is called the population evolutionary molecular clock hypothesis. And this is how they build their phylogenetic trees. And it's based off cytochrome C. And it's based on the molecular clock being consistent. But we do not. We believe in the metabolic rate hypothesis mixed with a combination of the longevity hypothesis, meaning that when you look at things, the human would have the slowest mutation rate because we have the highest generation time, being 29 years of age. Chimpanzee would be slower, and the gorilla would be faster would be in the chimpanzee. The gorilla would be even faster, and the orangutan would be faster than that. So if you were to build a phylogenetic tree based on that alone, what would it look like? Well, it would look like evolution. And that is the mistake that people make when they're looking at these charts. I'm trying to look for something that I took a picture of for you guys. Unfortunately, my desktop has about 1,000 tabs in it. But basically, it builds the phylogenetic tree. But we know that they all came out through the bottleneck at exactly the same time. So yes, it looks like there's an evolutionary phylogenetic chart showing the orangutan evolving first, and then gorilla, and then these. But that's not the case because they have different mutation rates clocks.
Boom. Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, keep going. Yeah, that was just a great point. Yeah, keep going. Don't mind me.
Okay, no problem. So let's say that these 150 years passed, right? How many generations would that orangutan have built? Well, it would have had more offspring, so it would have had more diversity because they would have had more generations. That's it. Humans would have had the least amount of generations, so they would have the least amount of diversity in them. And that's exactly what we see. Just like when you look at this chart, you see these things and you go, wow, that looks just like evolution. Well, we know that they arose at the same time because even they claim they arose at the genetic bottleneck at the same time. So of course we're looking at that. So we have a different perspective when we're looking at the data. We're not saying you're wrong because of this. We're just saying you're interpreting it in a different way than we are. Try looking at it from our perspective and you'll see something different. Because when they use the when they use the evolutionary phylogenetic tree, which comes from cytochrome C, assuming that mutation rates are consistently and can never change, they have discrepancies as well. And it's the same thing with the metabolic rate as well. You can't just use the metabolic rate because things like birds have an extremely fast metabolic rate. And so it's going to be different than a reptile, which has a very slow one. So then you have to look at the longevity hypothesis because that looks at reactive oxygen molecules in the body. So what that means is the older we get, the more senescence builds up and it builds slower and longer living animals. So you combine those two, and now we have a really good model of what we're looking at when we see different mutation rates in different things. That's why you can look at 3 different cat species and see different rates going on. It doesn't mean that the tiger's older than the lion because it has more mutations in it. It means that the tiger has a longer generation time. So you can see what I mean. You're going to see the discrepancies if you're trying to use the evolutionary thing. But since they built the charts based on this, of course it looks like evolution, right? But that's the problem. That's the problem. They got to look at it from a different perspective. That's all. Let's see. Kind of lost my train of thought, just rambling on. Good thing I take notes, I tell you.
Well, once again, they ignore the bigger picture. They can't grasp what you're saying there, which makes so much sense in the fact that double the generations, okay, in the same amount of time, right, of all of the human recorded history means double the amount of mutations, more genetic diversity.
Right.
And the combination of all of these things, okay, especially when it comes to the Neanderthals, I've had 3 debates on it. Okay. And of course they're not going to tap out, but the combination of all of these things we talk about, rapid early population growth, our bottlenecks according to the biblical model, patriarchal drive, fragmentation of the population after Babel, okay, with the subsequent long-term isolation of some of these groups, which results in what? Extreme inbreeding in many of these. Also, we can consider population surges and collapses, and selective sweeps. Selective sweeps we can look to in terms of war and conquest, or just natural selective sweeps. What does this create? It creates a recipe for exactly the type of trees that we see. Okay, exactly the type of phylogenetic trees that we see. Early human history was chaotic. Okay, so a lot of these deep branches, okay, and if we bring in the Neanderthals, all this indicates is the number of factors that I've just went over that you've covered. And yes, they'll never admit it because they're biased to the bone. It doesn't matter because they're only deceiving themselves. Everybody can see that they're losing horribly. The type of tree that they say we can't explain, the number of factors we've gone over gives us that exact tree. It gives us a perfect recipe for exactly the type of tree that we see, but they're so biased, Matt. They also won't make any predictions, okay? Nothing but pseudoscience coming from them. So that was some really, really great points. And it's just so funny how, they'll never tap out, because if it's the best they got, there's so much invested, okay? Like, for example, and I wrote an entire chapter on this in Special Creation, just demolish the out of Africa theory. Okay, these proponents, David here, Dan here, these proponents of the human evolution version of origins, okay, versus the special creation model and the out of Babel event. Okay, they assume that these higher levels of diversity, as you were saying, Matt, found in Africa, demonstrate man came from Africa, and that ultimately then Africans are older than other people groups. And as a consequence, the independent origins model that they can't refute. They're saying because of this, it cannot be true. For one, you notice how they never answer the question. I mean, I've been asking it ever since I got into debates. The fact that overall, there's still only a few mutations separating any person from the Eve sequence or the Y sequence. Even if you consider the deepest branches, okay, it's only 100 mutations removed. That's easy according to our model. Not to mention the linkage groups, Matt. The linkage groups, okay? Right. Why do we have so many large linkage blocks when, according to the evolutionary model, we're evolving for millions of years, okay, experiencing many rounds, many generations of recombination, gene conversion, shuffling up all of these DNA variants. Okay, the genome should be almost completely scrambled, even in Africans. Okay, but no, we still see the original chromosomal text strings that Adam and Eve would have had, because there's only been a few thousand years of genome shuffling and genome scrambling. If it was millions of years or even hundreds of thousands of years since there invoked bottlenecks, then the genomes of Africans and non-Africans should be even more scrambled, even more shuffled. And then when we consider the PRDM9 enzyme, and we consider all the other factors in terms of recombination, gene conversion, generation times, mutation, rates, the fact that Africans have historically lived closer to the equator, and for a number of reasons that we can touch on, mutations in DNA repair enzymes can speed up mutation rates as well. But it doesn't matter, because overall, their argument is horrible, because they're shooting themselves in the foot, because they're using the African diversity argument when it's actually worse for them, because there's no problem, even considering the most diverse people group, in coming to our numbers, our model. And the truth is, and then I'll yield here because I know I'm going on a rant, and he said a lot there. The truth is, our model of independent origins can better explain African diversity, because our model suggests what? Human diversity was subdivided after the biblical dispersal out of Babel. The divergence of the people groups then does not need a slow accumulation of mutations over deep time, as these evolutionists assume. Okay, the divergence we see in people groups can easily arise instantly. And remember, we've already destroyed their assumption of the molecular clock, okay, with the mitochondrial phylogenetic tree earlier that I showed. Okay, and I quote Sanford and Carter here. They point out that fragmentation of the source population and strong founder effects followed by assortative mating, people group divergence, is most consistent with a very recent fragmentation of the human race. If they got a problem with it, as they're going to, because of course they're not going to tap out and admit they're wrong, and now they're accountable to a creator, right? That creator being Jesus Christ himself, who died for us. No, they don't want to tap out and have to admit that. So they'll make more excuses, bring up the same talking points, but yet they won't explain the bigger picture. They won't explain that their best argument fails on their face. That's why they got egg on their face, because they can't explain the linkage blocks. They can't explain why there's so few mutations, and overall humans have low genetic diversity, even when considering Africans. So when we consider all things, Matt, different rates of gene conversion, recombination, different population events, different population histories, different environmental conditions, okay, it's all perfectly explained by our model. It's ridiculous, Matt, when this video came out, were we not hoping for more of a challenge? And then we watched it and we were like, this is bad.
I was excited to see what the new data was. And then it was essentially what was in Jeanson's paper already. But we'll get to that. I mean, I was, because that's the email that he got at the top. And this is exactly what's in Jeanson's paper. I was expecting a surprise, something different. That's all.
Yeah, actually, did you want to comment on that now, or do you want me to play a couple more minutes and then we'll smash all that, or what do you suggest? Sure.
I just had one more thing to say.
No, take your time. Don't mind me.
Okay. He basically said, remember, there's no mechanism that can slow up or speed down the mutation rates that we're seeing. We're saying that they're fast, and they're saying no, they're slow, and they're saying that there are things that change the mutation rate: selective sweep, genetic drift, selection, synergistic epistasis, genetic hijacking or hitchhiking. These are all alternating the mutation rate. These are the arguments that you use against us. So why are you telling us that nothing can change the mutation rate when you're invoking arguments that are telling us all the time that the mutation rate can be changed? It doesn't make sense. We really see, like, this is what I wanted to show you guys. This is the phylogenetic chart of evolution. And that is exactly what we would expect in our model, looking at the longevity of a species and the metabolic rate of the species. And it builds the exact same looking chart. So we're saying, look at it from a different perspective, and you will see this. That's all. Different rates. Right. In different kinds.
This is why your bench warmers, I guess, of Team Dodgeball now, even got to given her latest responses how bad they were. This is why she won't even attempt to address these overwhelming lines of evidence supporting independent origins, because she's hoping that people like Dan can do it. Okay. But then Dan's failing. Okay. There's not even a word for it. It's so bad. Saying Dan failed is putting it lightly, okay? It's like failed 2.0. It's bad. It's really bad. And if Dan can't do it, then obviously Erica can't. And that's why this long-winded battle, which has been a lot of fun and very laughable in many ways. This is why essentially Team Dodgeball and Guts and Gibbon, they've lost bad, and essentially they've tapped out in their minds. We know they have. Because if this is the best they got, it's exactly why we've dedicated so much time to writing all of these books, making all these videos, doing these discussions, these debates, because the evidence is overwhelming. And evolution, it's 2021, and evolution has been retired for good, especially when it comes to human origin. So did you want to say something, Matt, or do you want me to play another couple minutes, brother?
No, let's move on. That's a good idea.
Oh, and one thing, because Brother Tony in the chat. So in Erica's latest video, I mean, it's just a train wreck, right? I can't believe I sat through 4 hours worth of videos. Remember, we were chatting over text. I said I got a headache for a year, but I was able to just sit there. You and I were able to just sit there. I remember I was cooking some food, and I was just able to debunk it all just in my head on the spot. It's just so bad. And when it comes to the abiogenesis stuff, Erica says, I don't care about abiogenesis. Doesn't matter. Dan says the same thing. They all say the same thing because we've absolutely demolished naturalism. The point is they scoff at front-loaded genetic diversity, right, which is the most plausible explanation for origins, okay? And then they want to scoff at it. And then when you ask them for their plausible alternative, they fail. They fall right on their faces and say, well, we don't care about that. Yeah, you don't care about that because you've got chicken and egg problem after chicken and egg problem. We've had Dr. Rob Stadler on multiple times. He just gave an absolutely fatal blow to abiogenesis and naturalism last week with that presentation on the Stairway to Life. We've had Dr. Ryan Hayes here, Dr. Jonathan Sarfati, just destroying abiogenesis. Speed of Sound attempted to debunk one of them. Sarfati got like maybe 30 seconds into it, and you could see it in his face. He's like, ooh, this isn't going to look good for me. So he shut her down. I don't blame him. So they got nothing. It really is hopeless at this point. So I just found that funny, and it's just too much fun. So here, I'm going to share screen now, share audio, and boom.
But the results of this study already undermine this hypothesis. Now, this first statement will be pretty much repeated later on in this video. The most diverse humans in the mtDNA database are 123 base pairs apart. Yet after just 50,000 years of mutation, non-African humans would have been at least 170 base pairs different. Had we used the evolutionary date for the origins of the African people groups, e.g. 180,000 years ago, the predicted amount of mutational differences would have been even higher than 170 base pairs. Hence, the evolutionary model needs slower mutation rates overall, not just in non-African people groups. So, of course, the problem there is that his methodology is simply wrong, which we will talk about in a little bit. But there's an even bigger problem than all of that. Even if we concede the point that maybe Africans did in fact mutate a little bit faster, that still does not explain the fact that when we do a phylogenetic analysis of the genetic diversity, non-African genetics diversity is represented as a subset of African diversity. That is proof that we originated in Africa because we are a subset, a nested hierarchy of the African genetic group.
When you use evolution, how weird.
It's not that hard.
There's literally no other way to get that pattern.
I was just saying,
I apologize, brother. Go ahead.
I was just saying, isn't that strange that when you use evolution, it proves evolution? How strange. What are the odds? I mean,
right. It was like my debate the other day. Yeah, it was like my debate the other day with a rational empiricist. Use evolution to prove evolution. Their main argument, his main arguments came from cladistics, taxonomy, classification systematics that demonstrate a nested hierarchy. So now let's assume evolution to say that nested hierarchy is the result of descent with modification. I mean, do you see how circular it is? It's pathetic. And Dan's got nothing. And David has an excuse because he doesn't really understand a lot of this, which is fine. A lot of this is technical, but Dan doesn't have an excuse. He understands it. He clearly teaches it, and he's continuing his misrepresentations and straw man arguments to deceive his audience and deceive himself. But the majority of people are not deceived because Dan has dodged, and Dan shall dodge again. So, Matt, go ahead. I think I interrupted you there. Say what you need to, brother. Go on a rant. Hey, how do you feel? tell us what you really think about these arguments, brother. What's really on your mind?
I would have to say that when we're looking at things, look at what Parsons said. When he came across a study, he looked at this one and he goes, oh, they didn't find very many mutation rates. And so he investigated and he goes, perhaps the difference between these studies is basically explained by looking at the low number of independent lineages. That's what he said about Jeanson and her study. And so he said, I think we should use the maximum amount of diversity. And we should look at the broadest amount of spectrum when we're looking at people so we can catch that. And he's right, because let's say that we drive out and we find a rare island, and on that island lives a people, and we ask them how long they've been there. They go 5 generations. Do you expect to find a mutation rate in those people after 5 generations? You shouldn't, and I'll tell you why. Because mutations don't arise 1 every generation or 2 mutations per generation. It would be very easy to count them if they did that, but they don't. They arise very, very slowly. They're like 0.16 mutations per generation. So it takes multiple generations before you even see a mutation. So you need lots of diversity over longer amounts of time. That's why Parsons went all the way back to World War II, testing soldiers, so he could get the massive line going back in lineages. And the deeper you can go back, the more mutations you're expected to find, so you can get an accurate mutation rate based over that time. So when you go out and you find these studies that go, oh, they didn't get any mutations, investigate them, figure out why, the main reasons that they didn't catch those mutations, and you'll find there's a plethora of different answers. For example, well, I guess we'll get into that here pretty soon, but when we're going to investigate, because Dan brings up a study that didn't catch any mutations, and it's going to be explained in a very simplistic way, best way I can do it, and show that the reason why they didn't catch it is because of that very reason that I gave. But there's also, you can take hypervariable regions, right? In the D loop, there's hypervariable region 1 and 2. Well, they tick at different rates. 1 ticks faster than number 2 does. So when you're only looking, let's say at number 2, you're going to get a different outcome than you get from 1. You're supposed to gather both of them, because then you can see heteroplasmy. You combine them, and then you know that, oh, that's probably the rate. So there's lots of ways you can misinterpret data by not investigating entire sequences, not considering heteroplasmy, only looking in one region, looking at inbred people, looking at oh man, the diversity, the changes that are going on dramatically altered the result that you can get. Right? I mean, that's what they're saying happened to Jeanson. They're like, oh, he counted somatic mutations, that changes the rate. So you can't say that the rate can't be changed when you're invoking the argument that it can at the same time. That's all. Let's move on.
Great points, brother. Great points. Before I move on, logical, plausible, probable was in the he made a comment. He said Evos are not understanding a word that is coming out of Matt's mouth right now. So true. Now here's the thing. Dan might be, okay, but what Dan's doing right now, he's thinking, oh no, okay, I've been demolished again. But Dodgeball Dan is thinking, you know what I'll do? I'll go repeat substitution rates, bottlenecks, divergence rates, selection again for the 100th time. And some people, like Gutsy Gibbon, will be ignorant and stupid enough to actually believe that he's responded in any way, shape, or form. Don't you just love how they go to people like Dan or CRISPR for their answers, but they're just so easy to debunk, which means how easy are they to debunk? You know what I mean? That's why that's why, the people like Gutsy Gibbon, Dapper Dino, they'll focus on, the low quality, low confidence science. They'll let people like Dan deal with the high quality, high confidence science. But since people like Dan are failing miserably, well, they're stuck, spending their lives digging in the backyard for bones in the dirt, essentially.
Yeah, you said it good. Low confidence too, right? I mean, there's a lot of inference that you can do. You can play a lot of games. Matter of fact, a lot of games can be played with mutation rates as well, right? They're invoking that Jensen is playing games, right? Because games can be played. That's just the reality of it, because you can, they mess up a lot of times in these things because of the reasons that I was mentioning, right? They can ignore heteroplasmy. That was done for a while. And they can change generation times. They'll use the maximum range. They'll say they'll use a 35-year-old generation time to push the date back farther, right? Because they needed to land on something rather than use an earlier generation time, which changes the date. Check this study out, for example. This one, they observed, they literally watched 321 transmission events in the D loop and noticed 11 substitutions. What did they actually do? They removed half of them. They said, we are going to assume that those were somatic. And here's their 4 reasons for assuming that they were. So see what they did? They got the exact same rate as Parsons, 11 out of right here. Parsons got like 10 out of 306 or something, right? So they basically got exactly what Parsons did and Howell did in the other studies, but they said that can't be right. So they just, boom, they just busted out assumptions. So that's right. Anything can be played. You just have to stand back and go, what's making the logical conclusion? They're telling us that Parsons is the outlier and we're not, and we're being biased towards his work, but we're showing you, no, there's multiple examples where we're seeing the same conclusion in these fast mutation rates. And you guys are being the biased ones saying, no, we're not agreeing with the phylogenetic tree. Of course we're not, because that's what's in question. We don't need to agree to anything because that's the thing that we're questioning.
Right. And that's why this book right here is so significant. The true story of mutation rates that we worked on. Because if you want like a full breakdown of every single mutation rate study, okay, and then this is the one that I've been citing a lot throughout the book, that these, okay, you get a combination of those 3, okay? Refuting the critics, special creation, and this book goes through, Matt, this book goes through literally every single mutation rate study that has to do with pedigrees and that would either support our model or support the universal common ancestry model, right? And we show it's a fatal blow to them, but they just want to ignore it over and over again. Redefine living, just put it into the chat. This has all been dealt with. It's the book I just released, for example, the special creation. It's dealt with all these in incredible detail, ton of citation sources. So this is just becoming too fun, isn't that right, Matt? So I wanted to plug those books, specifically the mutation rate book, because Erica, I believe it was Erica, who was saying, they just focus on a couple studies that support their position or something. I mean, how many studies do we go through in this one single book?
Oh, I would say everyone from 1997 and on. I mean, there were 2 before that, but they were all over the place. They were kind of guessing. They didn't know what they were looking at. So I just went from like 97 and on, because that's when Howell jumps in there and he was really one to investigate. So I just go all the way up into the current time. So I covered, oh man, I would say an average around 10 of the different studies. I didn't look at any of the animal ones, but we could get into
right. Yeah, of course, for humans.
Yeah, just humans, right? Keep it simple. I mean, we can jump into talking about chickens because they did that on the wild Gallus. We could look at penguins. We can look at, they've done pedigree rates on these animals. And guess what? They're all fast. None of them match phylogeny. They're an order of magnitude out of the way. So you would think at least some would go, oh, well, they push all the way back. It's just humans that are the outlier. But no, it's in, go ahead and type in pedigree and find an animal species. They're fast in all pedigree studies. So something happened recently to reset this mitochondria. And Erica just randomly threw out that it just happens every couple 100,000 years. But the problem with that theory is that all of it at exactly the same time, that's a very peculiar hypothesis to come up with. I've never heard that before. I mean, matter of fact, I don't even know if the scientists have heard of that because they're still looking for the bottleneck. So,
well, yeah, which there's no evidence for. Yeah. Okay, so let's keep going here. Great points. This has been great so far. So I'll share audio. I'm going to mute myself again so there's no echo. What we'll do this time, Matt, let's let it play for a couple minutes through, and then we'll address everything. because we watched it beforehand. So let's do that. Here we go.
Unless the African set of diversity on that tree is the root of the tree. There's no other way to get the pattern of nested diversity that we observe in actual human populations. It's simply not possible.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
that simple. Like it really is that simple.
Yeah. So here's another paragraph that I want to draw everyone's attention to. Scripturally, all ethnic groups likely find their ultimate origins at the Tower of Babel. Genetically, the structure of the human mtDNA tree reflects this event. No, it doesn't, implying that non-African and African groups originated at the same time in history. Based on the successful results of the study, I predict that the most diverse African groups will be found to mutate their mtDNA at a rate twofold faster than reported here. Well, there's his prediction, but where is his test? Where does he actually test the hypothesis? He simply doesn't.
You got to test that.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then he says, conversely, the results of this study demonstrate that the current rate of mtDNA mutations in non-Africans is predictable for the young Earth timescale and from the mtDNA diversity among extant humans. He says that this underscores the previous contention that DNA sequences from fossil sources degraded can be useful for comparative DNA analysis today. So, again, there's his prediction, but where does he actually test that prediction? And then this is
I do want to point out for everybody, this was 2017. There have not been subsequent follow-ups where he goes through and actually collects those data and tests these predictions. They're just out there and they're not.
I think it's
2015.
Could you imagine Jeanson being out there in deep Africa, people covered in malaria, mosquitoes all over him? He's trying to get their blood. I want to.
And not to mention the papers that they ignore on. And here's the thing: Erica finally admitted, okay. You know, he's put out a couple papers on the history of civilization and the Y chromosome, and you know he's written about the results of some of his predictions. So she's attempted by parroting Swami Das to rebut, you know, his arguments, his findings, and it was just the worst ever. So we demolished that, showed why no, these are testable predictions, okay, that can essentially only be true. I'm trying to find the papers. That can only be true if the young Earth creation model is true. She failed. We responded. Dan tried to do a blind rebuttal to our correction, and it was just, I mean, you could see it in his face where he's like, oh, I wasn't prepared for this. So I did a couple-hour response to that, just absolutely dismantling. Gene's right here. So here's the evidence for a human Y chromosome molecular clock, suggests 4,500-year history for human paternal inheritance. So they'll scoff at this. Here's the predictions where he tested the predictions. He's had an active research program. The predictions are working. And as many times as I explain this prediction when it comes to the history of civilization, okay? And I just want to make sure I did unmute myself. So when it comes to the history of civilization, okay, if the Y chromosome clock really only goes back a few thousand years, and the mitochondrial DNA clock only goes back a few thousand years, okay? These phylogenetic trees are really only a reflection of biblical time. Then we should essentially be able to read history of civilization from these trees, right? If this is just a reflection of a few hundred generations, that means, because the evolutionists want to say this is a reflection of hundreds of thousands of years. Okay, so to them, the last 6,000 years of human history, more specifically 4,500 years of human history, especially with Jeanson's model that says those three nodes are Noah's three daughters-in-law. Therefore, to the evolutionists, take a really long needle, the very end of the needle, that's human history, you know, the last 4,500 years. So essentially, there should be nothing but noise. But Jeanson's prediction is no. This is all a reflection, including the Y chromosome tree. This is all a reflection of thousands of years. Therefore, there should be more signal than noise. Evolutionists would predict more noise than signal. We would predict more signal than noise. And therefore, Jeanson is testing for signatures and genetic stamps in terms of the history of civilization found within our genetics, right? Specifically historical events. Transatlantic slave trade, you know, the history of the Roman Empire, Greek Empire, Persian Empire, Genghis Khan, different conquests throughout history. So what turns, it's funny because the Y chromosome, you know, you would have thought might have been more difficult in terms of this prediction. And it turns out that the Y chromosome has been the most fruitful in terms of prediction. So not even Dan comments on any of this. Okay. He won't challenge Jeanson and do a head-to-head prediction and say, no, I will demonstrate more signal than noise. No, the evolutionist knows there's more noise than signal if their deep time history is true. Okay. The question is, okay, why are these predictions working so well? So yes, he has been testing them. There's been subsequent papers showing that the predictions are working, which only Erica has attempted to rebut through Swamidas and through Evograd. It's been a ripple effect of errors and mistakes. We've demolished that in a series of videos. Those videos have been ignored. They will continue to be ignored because the critics need to deceive themselves. Now, when it comes to the predictions with the Khoisan peoples, like you said, can you picture Jeanson taking a flight, you know, over to somewhere in Africa to take the blood samples himself and test the mutation rates? You know, that's one that is yet to be tested, but it's still a future prediction that all the data suggests will probably turn out to be true. Not to mention, Jeanson himself says, hey, you point to an animal in the wild, and what does he say, Matt? I'll tell you its mutation rate. I'll tell you how much its genetics changes over time. Because if we look to the family and you want to take two felid species, look at the DNA differences that separate them, check the molecular clock, figure out generation times, you can be able to trace back to an original genetic sequence, to the original cat kind. They also never discuss the predictions that Jeanson has made in terms of nested hierarchical patterns in nuclear DNA, mitochondrial DNA, and these highly conserved mitochondrial proteins like the cytochrome C. He's made specific predictions. I discussed those predictions with RJ Downard in my last debate with him. His face, he looked like he was so lost. These people are not up to date on the technical literature, on the arguments from creationists. And that's why people like Jeanson don't take them seriously. When Dan messaged Jeanson probably thought, oh, is that guy that constantly strawman and misrepresents me, who's out of date on the data and out of touch with reality? That's probably what he thought. He's not going to waste his time with Dodgeball Dan. Anyways, your turn, Matt. Go ahead. You can rant for a bit.
Wow. I don't know if I can follow that. That was good. Okay, we left off with Dan. He was talking about, what did he say? He was talking about the phylogenetics showing mutations. Oh no, it was mostly David too, complaining that Jeanson isn't actually going out into the field and testing those things. Yeah, pedigree rates aren't really done that often, from what I can tell. Obviously, I put every study I could find in the most recent book, but they still are done. And people are still using them. So obviously they have some type of validity. I mean, if evolutionists themselves are using pedigree rates, but they don't believe in the pedigree rate, then why are they using them? It doesn't even make logical sense, right? If they're like, this disproves evolution and therefore they're completely wrong, we need to stop using them, that would be the case. They would only use phylogeny. But the fact that they are valid and they're called the empirical rate shows me that they do have validity to them, probably a stronger case than phylogeny, because you don't need any assumptions. You can literally look at the rate. So what I intend to get into is showing you guys how studies are pulling their data together now, and they're slowing that rate down a little bit. Meaning what they're doing is they're like, okay, we see this fast mutation rate in our study, but there were studies over here that obtained 0 mutation rate. So when we pull all that data together, it's no longer 1 mutation every 33 generations. It's like 1 in 66 or 1 in 90. So they slow the clock really far down. And I'll tell you why that's kind of disingenuous to do as we move on in the video. So let's rock.
Yeah, let's do it. This is awesome. Here we go.
Even worse, it's been 5 years. It's been 5 years.
Yeah, I think the paper he does as a follow-up with the unitary, does he do anything by testing his predictions? Since you've read that paper and I haven't.
No.
Yeah, that is deeply problematic. But I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to the length of the paper. This is only 4 pages in length. And if you are doing an mtDNA analysis of calculating the time to most recent common ancestor, your paper is going to be much longer than 4 pages if you are doing the technique properly. And I counted the number of references that he had down at the bottom, and only came to about 17 papers. And of this 17, you see Creation Research Society, you see that Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson cited himself twice, Jeanson 2015 and Jeanson 2013. More creationists.
There are other names many of you will recognize in there. There's two from Tompkins. There's some Snelling in there. It's all familiar names.
Yeah. I actually don't see Snelling in here.
He's a second author on one of them.
Okay.
Yeah, he's on that last one. Snelling is the second author.
Okay, there we go. Okay, the rate project, which
there you go. Yeah, all right.
These are just basic issues with it.
Yeah.
And we're going to have a lot of fun with this paragraph here. The brief results presented here strengthen the. Here we go. The only remaining caveat to this present result is whether or not the mutation rate reported in Bing et al. Represents a germline rate rather than a somatic mutation rate. To confirm a germline transmission in the future, the DNA sequences from at least 3 successive generations must be sequenced to demonstrate that variants were not artifacts of mutations accumulations in non-gonal cells. So, quick. He's basically saying, I don't know. It's one way or the other, but I'm going with the other way. Now let's use our brains for a moment and think for a minute. If you were Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson and you were using things to study and you weren't sure if it was somatic or germline, what would you do? What if there was a very easy way to get a hold of the author of the original paper and ask him? I know, maybe email him. And spoiler alert, that's exactly what I did. I emailed the lead author of the Ding study, Lynn Ding. I actually emailed them, and they got back to me. And we are going to have a lot of fun with that response later on. So with that, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so we're gonna wind up right with that email. So I want to first highlight the other major problems with this paper. So I'm going to go back to my screen here because it gets better. But wait, there's more. What Jeanson basically sets up in that paragraph that David just read is that you have the somatic rate. You have all the mutations of all the cells in the body, the muscles, and the neurons, and the stomach, and everything else. And then you have the germline rate, the mutations that are in the cells that produce gametes that could potentially get passed on. Now, that is just wrong in terms of calculating a long-term mutation rate because you are doing a heck of a lot more filtering than just somatic to germline. So I used these slides when I talked to Sal Cordova a few weeks ago on the same topic, and I'll just briefly go through them here. But if you consider this oval, this is all mutations, every tissue in your body. Now, the germline represents a subset of that. This is not to scale. The germline does not represent most of the mutations. The germline represents a teensy tiny fraction of the mutations in the body, right? Just think about just in terms of like numbers of cells. How many cells are in the ovaries and testes compared to the rest of the body? It's just not that many, right? So the germline mutation rate is going to be a very small subset of the total mutations that occur in the body. Now, Jeanson basically cuts it off there and says, but if it's in the germline, you're good, that can persist. No, because you still have to get into the gametes. And this is a problem for both males and females. Not every cell that could make sperm is actually going to ultimately make sperm. Most cells in females and ovaries don't ultimately become secondary oocytes. Most of them don't. So like, just think about how the ovarian cycle works. You have a bunch of follicles mature every month, and then only one of them is actually going to go through ovulation, right? Sometimes it's 2, and that's why you get fraternal twins. But for the most part, it's 1. And then the other like 3, 5, 10, 15, however many there are, those just go away. They're dead, right? So all the mutations and the ones that don't mature, those mutations are gone. So you have a germline to gamete filtering step where you lose a bunch of mutations. Now, those gametes, the vast majority of those don't go through fertilization, don't become a zygote, right? So again, you have another layer of filtering. And then the zygote, of course, has to successfully grow into an adult for that mutation to persist in the population. And then the adult also has to go through, in the next generation, you got to go through all these steps again, right? You have to all the mutations in the adult, they have to be in the germline, make it to the gametes, yada, 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 over many generations in order to actually persist in a population. What we care about when it comes to long-term mutation rates, time to most recent common ancestor calculations, what we need to do is use the substitution rate. So here's what Jeanson claims. He says, I use the germline rate, it's cool. He ignores all the levels of filtration kind of below the germline rate. He's just pretending everything that makes it to the germline, all those mutations persist. Yeah, David, go ahead.
Yeah, by the way, I did a Command F on my Mac just to make sure I didn't miss anything. The word substitution.
Well, once again, that was every time Dan speaks, he just wastes time going through, germ cell line mutations, talking about the gametes, talking about how somatic cell line mutations don't get passed on, and how we need to look to the long-term mutation rate because a lot of these mutations are filtered out, including from generation to generation. A lot of them won't even be passed on, and therefore the substitution rate is more important. I mean, just the same thing over and over again. And yet we point out, yes, we understand all these basics. We understand this. Okay. The fact is, these things have been considered. Here's a couple phylogenetic trees that give you the bigger picture view. And it doesn't matter. Even when you consider African genetic diversity, the human population, African, non-African, only a few mutations removed. That's it. You're never going to get to your evolutionary date. Okay, never. That's why they won't make predictions. So, but you know, at least we're just going through the video minute by minute, so nobody can accuse us of not addressing every single point. But the assumption after assumption being made by Dan, and then the waste of time just explaining basic scientific knowledge on pedigrees and substitutions and so on and so forth. So anyways, I'll hand it over to you, Matt. What are your thoughts on everything that was just said by David there in terms of arguments? Because Dan didn't really have any arguments, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, well, Dan just is used to teaching, so I don't even know if he notices it. That's just what comes out of his mouth. He's a teacher, right? So he's just constantly teaching people. He expects them to not know what the hell he's saying. So I can understand that. Let's see. Sure. Did he brought up saying that you can't take a germline mutation rates back to a most recent common ancestor, but that's done all the time. Here was a study that was done, and she traced using the hypervariable regions 1 and 2, and she said the most recent common ancestor would be right back. She tested Europeans. Okay, this is just the European lineage. So we would say this would be Japheth's line, Noah's son that spawned the Europeans. So what you're supposed to do in these studies, she took both of these and you combine them. So you get a most recent common ancestor about 247.5 generations ago. Now you notice that she used the higher end of the generation time, but if you reduce it to 21.5 years, you get 5,321 years ago. That's exactly when I say the flood happened. Anyway, that we're seeing that they do use these pedigree rates to find a most recent common ancestor. So yes, you can take this germline mutation rate and filter it out and go back to exactly what he says they don't use them for. So I don't know, maybe he hasn't read the study. But what else? Oh, he showed Evograd's chart, or was that? No, that was a chart he might have made, actually. So let's see, he was saying about what matters more is mutations becoming fixed. Yes, we love fixed mutations because there's only 24 of them, right? So we use that as an example of why our model is so strong. So yes, we use that. Parsons did that, actually. So I don't know if Jeanson's study was looking directly at substitutions whatsoever. I don't think they were, because remember, it wasn't supposed to be about a mutation rate, really. So Jeanson used it for one, but that's what he does, right? So his specialty is genetics, by the way. He has peer-reviewed studies on stem cells, so I'm pretty sure he knows how to read the studies. And we'll get into that in a little bit, but I just wanted to make sure I covered everything. And I would just have to say that people invoke these different rescue devices, you know, this genetic drift and selection is removing these things, but that just proves that there's a problem above anything else, right? Why would they invoke something if there's not a problem with these rates? We invoke that a bottleneck did this, and that's what reset all the mitochondrial DNA. You know, but because of course there's 3 different lines in humans, we can take the mitochondria back to Eve, not just the ark. You see, animals were brought onto the ark in 2 by 2, so we can trace the bottleneck of the animals to the ark. But humans go beyond that because there were 3 women actually on it. And later, I think you hear David say, "We failed because we need to track mtDNA rates back 4,500 years or something." But that's not true, because there were 3 mitochondrial lineage, 4 if you count Noah's wife, on the ark itself. So no, we would track it back to a single one, and that would be Eve. That's why we track the Y chromosome to Noah, because he was the only line that was on the ark, but not mitochondria. So he must have understood that. No, I guess we're good. Let's move on.
All right, perfect. Since we're going on 2 hours, let's play another few minutes, and then because I know we've got notes for the whole video, because we're going on the 2-hour mark, and I got to get to dinner soon. So let's do this. Let's play another couple minutes. We'll stop it there. I mean, we've already demonstrated what a worthless video this is. And then we'll just kind of reiterate to the audience their last few points in the last bit of the video, and then just demolish them. Does that sound good?
Yeah. Okay. All right. Sounds good.
All right, let's do it.
does not appear anywhere in his paper.
Doesn't appear at all.
Just wanted to throw that out there.
So Jeanson claims he uses a germline rate. What he says is, well, it could be somatic, it could be germline, we're going to go with germline. He says, it's kind of wishy-washy. What he actually counts based on his techniques, and as we'll see, we have an update on this front, is all mutations, somatic and germline, right? What he actually counts is everything. Now, what matters for time to most recent common ancestor are the fixed substitutions, what mutations that occur that ultimately become fixed in the population. What we care about is the rate at which new mutations fix in the population. Now, the key thing here is that because you have all these filtration steps, plus you have natural selection, genetic drift, bottlenecks, right? You have all these steps that weed out genetic diversity. So given a mutation, the likelihood that it persists within a population decreases over time. So the mutation accumulation rate, or being more technical, the substitution rate, the rate at which mutations fix, is way, way, way lower than the spontaneous mutation rate, the rate at which mutations occur. And this is a figure from Evograd's excellent multi-part review / debunking of Jeanson's book, Replacing Darwin. And this shows basically this schematic relationship. So you have the time on the x-axis and the rate on the y-axis. So your spontaneous mutation rate is very high. But very quickly, you start to weed out those mutations due to all the filters that I just described. And as you go through all those filters, you converge at the evolutionary substitution rate, or you sometimes hear the phrase the long-term substitution rate. That is what we care about when it comes to calculating the time to most recent common ancestor. You cannot take a pedigree rate and a germline rate and extrapolate backwards. And I should note that Jeanson conflates those two things. They're not the same thing, but whatever. You can't take a germline rate or a pedigree rate, which is going to be up here, and extrapolate that backwards over time to get your time to most recent common ancestor. You simply cannot do it. It's like, that's not how these processes work. It's just wrong. It's not more complicated than that. Now let's assume that none of that stuff matters. Let's assume that everything Jeanson did, let's assume he measured mutations right, he did the math right. Let's just assume that nothing David just talked about and nothing I just talked about matters. Would Jeanson be correct if we took everything at face value? Nope. And the reason is what we'll get into now. First is that paragraph that David showed you where he says, we don't know if it's germline or somatic rate. We think it's germline, so we're going to go with germline, right? That's the first place. This is the disclaimer paragraph where Jeanson says, if you understand the language, what Jeanson is saying here is everything I just said, I don't know, maybe, but he says it in a a sciencey way. So if you're not trained in the field, you probably wouldn't catch that. Who knows? So now David actually got a hold of Nathaniel Jeanson, and David, I have it popped up right here, but you want to just tell everybody what you asked him?
Yeah, so I actually had asked him a couple of questions about this, about Neanderthals, and about African genetics, and about a control.
All right, here we go. I'll point out to the audience, we've touched on a lot of Dan's repeated talking points about substitution rates, as everybody who's been watching for the last 2 hours knows. So, we're not going to spend too much time reiterating those points, those arguments. But Matt, go ahead, man. Just demolish what they said. I'm not going to play any more of the video. We got 35 minutes into it, and now we're going on the 2 hour mark. Therefore, just reiterate their next few points that they make throughout the video. We'll just demolish them all. So go ahead, brother. I'll mute myself.
All right. Well, the first thing that was brought up was a picture of the Evograd's chart. It was talking about the population size and how the spontaneous mutation rate eventually goes back and it matches with the evolutionary chart. But then again, we showed earlier that it comes down to population size because fixation reaches quicker results based on the population size. And the filtrations and everything like that, these are taken into account in some of the pedigree rate studies. So, that's just kind of it. When we look at the chart here, the email itself directly from Ding, there's nothing new. I mean, this isn't like Dan's been using this argument. I don't know why this was some miraculous new discovery. I think I heard Dan say it even like a month ago. It's definitely in the paper. He knows. Jeanson said, yeah, it's still, we don't know directly if they are all, if some of them are somatic, but I realize that. That's why I'm making testable predictions on them not being somatic, but them being germline. He says directly, if you look at the email, it's almost word for word verbatim. So how do you know that Jeanson didn't actually email him and ask him those exact questions? Because it's almost like a copy and paste. In what's on the bottom is from Jeanson's paper that you can find. And it's literally almost verbatim exactly what the email was. So you guys didn't actually learn anything from the email. That was already there in his paperwork. That's good. And if you notice, Ding was unable to say that Jeanson was actually wrong because they just don't know. They assume it could be represent a combination, but read it again. They use the word assume. But Jeanson did say time and time again, he knows this. And he strongly feels it's germline. So, you know, that's why he said, put it to the test. Go pick your animal, use your evolutionary theory. I'll use young Earth creationist timeline of divergence, and we will make a prediction based on the mutation rate that you expect and that we expect, and we'll see which one comes to be true. So, you know, I don't know how that's a slam dunk when Jeanson's got it in himself, unless Jeanson really wanted to debunk himself in the very article that he wrote and then laugh that nobody would ever realize it. That seems pretty crazy, actually. That would be a twister, wouldn't it? I'm going to debunk myself in this article, see if anyone catches it. But no, like I said, he feels strong about it. And it seems to me as though either Jeanson is extremely good at what he does and got the exact same mutation rate that Ding did by running the numbers himself, or that he just simply emailed them and asked, what would be the mutation rate if you made one in your study? And he just sent him the answer, because they're so identical to one another. And then David says Jeanson misrepresents the data, and he made up his conclusions because he's a fraud. David loves the word fraud. Standing for Truth is a fraud. I'm a fraud. Jeanson's a fraud. So I'm sure if he ever joined our team, Erica and Dan would be frauds. But it's kind of like
yeah, good point.
That's just kind of his go-to. You know, that's like you know, like dodgeball, right? We say dodgeball. He says fraud. So it's all right. Then he says something really strange. He goes, and that was what I reiterated earlier. Later you can listen to the video, and he goes on and says, no, we need 4,500 years, not 6,000. And Dan nods his head to this. What? Dan would know by now, I would think, both of them should, that our model doesn't say that humans go back to the bottleneck. There were multiple humans on the ark that would have mtDNA in them, not just two. It wasn't just Noah and his wife. So I don't really know where they get that one woman on the ark and all mutation rates for humanity should go back there. I don't know. It's kind of either a straw man or just wrong. But then he says, Dan says, nuclear DNA rates go way past that. Yes, we know this. That's the literal title of our model, created heterozygosity, meaning differences were built into the nuclear DNA. And
isn't that so funny? Matt, I'll interrupt you here and then I'll yield myself again because you're doing such a great job. But the second I saw that, my eyes rolled into the back of my head, and it reminded me of Jeanson versus Mays, Herman Mays, where Mays had 6 to 8 months to prepare for the debate. Mays totally failed, couldn't even answer Jeanson's question because Jeanson was cross-examining him. He was using a method of debating to expose the opponent for not having done the relevant research prior to the discussion, where Mays was using the same argument from nuclear DNA that even if mitochondrial DNA takes us back a few thousand years, by definition, nuclear DNA takes us back even further, without even realizing that the main model, right, the thesis of nuclear heterozygosity states that the majority of nuclear DNA is a result of created nuclear heterozygosity, which has its own set of predictions that flow from it. Dan is so worthless in terms of arguments, where he doesn't really add anything to the discussion. Godzilla Freak pointed that out in the chat, because even Dan has admitted that he doesn't really have much to add in terms of any other topic, right? So he's now run out of talking points when it comes to this topic, right? So he doesn't really have anything else to add, okay? So then he goes and misrepresents Jeanson's position. Then when you give him the answer, he'll just say, well, that's ad hoc. Then he won't address the predictions coming from the nuclear DNA, okay? And he won't give a plausible alternative when it comes to abiogenesis because he says it's not his field, he doesn't know, he doesn't care. So it's just like, I mean, if Dan's your expert, that's pretty sad. So I yield. Go ahead, brother. Keep going. You're doing a great job.
All right. Thanks, man. Sure. So he was talking again that the somatic and germline are being different and that we should be able to account for that. But I showed earlier that the pedigree rates and sequence divergence that are taken into consideration in these pedigree mutation rates show that the somatic variants usually show up as germline. So when they look at a mutation and they go, we're not really sure if that's somatic, they can either discount it or they can decide, I'm going to keep this in the study. And Parsons said most of these studies are actually discounting things that they think are somatic. In reality, they should be keeping them. And I posted that earlier, but since I've been deleting pictures as I've been putting them up, sadly, I got rid of it. And then later he goes and says, well, Soodyal, Soodyal, did a study and acquired 0 mutations. So that right there invalidates the pedigree rate mutation in general. But notice that Dan was saying that the filtering of the gametes and the zygotes through multiple generations is what's key. Yet this study itself didn't go through very many generations, like at all. Matter of fact, when we look at the study right here, what do we see? This one looked at a single related group of people that spanned for a short duration of time. Since mutations are not, as I said earlier, 1 mutation per generation, you need multiple generations, especially when you're only testing a single family lineage, right? So if there's 0.16 mutations on average per generation, how many generations do you need to see before you expect around 1 mutation? Well, at minimum, you need 7 to 8, 9, somewhere around there. So when Soodyal, if I hope I'm saying that right, his maximum spanning was about from 8 to 11 generations. And that's only assuming a generation of 20 years old. And that's what they did in the study. So going all the way back to 1816, the first woman arrived on the island, and she had twin girls that were born in 1826. Since the average mutation rate, not being whole, you wouldn't expect to find many mutations. Matter of fact, you would be hard pressed to find one in the first place. So why would there be a high expectation rate of finding multiple mutations in this study? There wouldn't be. There just wouldn't. So the takeaway is that they would have been lucky to even find a single mutation rate if this was just one pure unbroken chain line of from that mother to the entire line with no other women coming onto the island. Well, guess what? They ran the mutation mtDNA to find out what was going on. They discovered 5 different mtDNA lineages. They said that's strange. So they didn't expect that maybe more women arrived on the island. They just said that it probably came from the paternal side. So men came and they passed on their mitochondria, because men can do that just a little bit. They, that men have a little bit of heteroplasmy going on when they have some children as well. But so they expected that that's probably why there were differences, but they don't really know because they had found different mtDNA lineages. So even if a couple other women showed up to the island, it broke that one line lineage that was going on, and it would have added some disparity in the results. So we have a descendants over 171 years maximum, and that's not very deep going back in time to even find one mutation. So that's why. So when Dan says, they need to have multiple generations because that's key, you're exactly right. That's exactly why. So when they asked Parsons, like, why didn't Soodyal find any? You know what he said? He said the control region, for example, promotes replication and transcription of the mtDNA. So any mutation that interferes with the efficiency of these processes might be deleterious and therefore selected against, reducing the apparent mutation rate. So since there was inbreeding, obviously one single family having kids and those kids marrying their own kids, we would expect to find that maybe the mutation rate would not be seen because selection would have removed that one mutation that would have arisen in that time because it would have been highly deleterious. So there's another thing. So what happens today? Well, they take that Soodyal study, like they do with others that also acquire 0 mutations, and they pool them all together and they slow this mitochondrial mutation rate down. And then the anti-creationists come along and says, look, these mutation rates pool all their data together and they don't get anything around 6,000 years anymore. It's like, well, of course not. They've just filtered in studies that shouldn't have been filtered in together and pooled into the data to make their conclusions because those studies didn't belong there in the first place. They got horrible results because they should have never been testing for a mutation rate. I can understand them testing to get who's related to who, but I mean, to be testing a mutation rate when it's clearly has multiple flaws. You've got inbreeding, you don't have a deep lineage, you have the chance of I mean, they're in the island out here. It's like one of the smallest islands in the region, and it was a hub for pirates. So you're getting people coming there and smugglers, and they're trading, and that's where they're doing their illegal activities. I'm sure they're trading women off at the same time. But what's going on is they track this lineage using they were Christians, so they had documented history of when they were married. That's why they knew who was the first woman on that island and when she married their man. So they just assumed that all generations sprung directly from that mother. And even if that is the case, we're looking at between 8 to 11 generations maximum. And then on top of it, they're inbred. So the chances of finding one mutation because of those two reasons alone would be very, very rare and very hard. So there's that reason. All right, that was good on that. So I guess here's what I want to this should be obvious, but think about it. If selection removes mutations, obviously it wouldn't be seen nor counted towards a mutation rate. So if selection is just removing random mutations, then obviously they wouldn't make their way up to fixation. That's fine. We can account for this. Yet this is where we're seeing, the germline mutations. So this is what confused Kondershoff as well. This is what confuses a lot of people. We have this fast mutation rate. We have few fixed substitutions, and they have books written on hypothetical scenarios to solve the problem. But you notice that they all have different arguments. Why would there even be an argument if there wasn't a problem? It's only the problem for evolutionists because that's why they're trying to solve it. Then this isn't just from a single observable pedigree mutation rate that Jeanson formed. This is from all of the pedigree rates. Even the slowest they can put them is still 10% faster than the phylogenetic rate. So let that sink in, right? So they must invoke hypothetical solutions to their arguments. That's why they have gene conversion, genetic drift, selection, sweep, compensatory mutations, synergistic epistasis, genetic hijack or hitchhiking. All these are different mechanisms to help solve the problem to this riddle of extremely fast mutation rates that only go back a few hundred generations, no matter which direction you work. But that's what they are. And that's what we keep reminding people. Yes, we realize that these are possible mechanisms that can do it. But so far, what we've seen, they're still consecutively fast. There's still the empirical rate. They're still being used by, FBI. They're being seen in even recent studies. The 2012 got exactly the same as Parsons back in 97. So clearly there's some discrepancies going on. Now, here's the thing. If evolution was true, how many substitutions should we see in humanity? Well, if humanity has been around for millions of years, splitting from a missing link common ancestor, and through time having multiple bottlenecks with small populations of tribes living for thousands of generations, through multiple bottlenecks, we would find a lot more than the measly 24 fixed substitution differences, don't you think? Kind of simple. I can keep going if you want.
Yeah, keep going. You're killing it, brother. You're killing it. I mean, we both watched the video, so anything else that they might say in the next 15 minutes or so before the end of the video, we can make sure we cover. Yeah, I mean, it kind of sounds like you just kind of covered the rest of it there, but yeah, it's hilarious. It's like you were saying with genetic entropy, right? They invoke rescue device after rescue device after rescue device after rescue device. They all have their own explanation for something that doesn't exist, apparently. I mean, that is just hilarious. It would be like somebody coming up with a hypothesis that says the moon is made out of green cheese, and then I come up with all these rescue devices to show why, the moon is not made of green cheese. Well, nobody comes up with rescue devices for something so silly because we know that that's not a fact. But you could just see how desperate they are to fight the reality of genetic entropy, that they do take it seriously. Once again, they're only deceiving themselves because they've all got their own different rescue device that they like to hold on to. So yeah, and I'll yield, and you just say whatever else you have to say, brother. We're going on 2 hours and 10 minutes, so
Oh
we'll
my
shut
God.
it down when so I think this has been total destruction. Everybody in the audience can see how worthless their so-called rebuttal was. This might have even been easier to address than Dan's, quote unquote blind rebuttal on the Y chromosome. But I will say this. I'm going to screen share for people, guys, especially for people who might be new to this channel since we just hit 3K subscribers. We've got a ton of, I put together playlists here, okay, addressing all your critics' best arguments when it comes to, I mean, as you know, Matt, all subjects. Here we go. You'll find a playlist for biology, genetics, refuting the critics, okay, the flood, for example, debunking specific people like Dr. Dan Cardinale here, specific topics, ERV. So tons of playlists here, playlists for abiogenesis, for example. So my point is, if Dan and David respond, we already know it's going to be the same talking points that we've addressed over and over again, okay? Matt knows we've got a massive list of videos that we're waiting to still respond to, and we got a lot of work to do too. So, we're not going to waste our time, because my prediction would be, David would do a response, maybe have Dan there. Dan will repeat the same things over and over again. They won't address the bigger picture. They won't address the phylogenetics. They won't address anything that you stated here. And therefore, it would just be a waste of our time to now respond to the same talking points, if you know what I mean. You know what I mean? So I think this is just pure destruction, and their damage control will be there for us to just laugh at, essentially. So I'm going to yield the mic to give you the last few, however long you need to address anything you feel, because, I mean, we rewatched the video last night, so if there's anything that you want to say in order to leave no stone unturned, go ahead, brother.
Sure. Let me upload something real quick for everybody. We say in the young Earth creation model that animals were on the ark and they got off. Clearly, this is what Jeanson also believes. And the mutation differences that we're seeing in these things are what I explained earlier in showing that if all these species got off the ark at the same time, why would they have different diversity? Well, according to the evolutionary model, they do because mutation rates being the same over a deep time, this species on the far right, the pongo, the orangutan, has existed longer. And that's why it has more than the gorilla next to it, and the gorilla has more than us. So therefore, we can see that theirs is built on the assumption of time, as where ours is exactly the same through that door. And the differences come down to longevity of the species and generation time, meaning when they have the offspring. So based on this, Jeanson has a model that is predicting, based on the mutation rate, that differences arise and we will see them in humans. So you guys are waiting now for the differences to come from the Kusan people or people groups that are in Africa to see if their mutation rate is different. So I thought I would speed this up a little bit and do it with cats and a couple other species, but this is just on cats for right now. So if there was a cat on the ark and it got off, what would explain the diversity that we see in cats today based on the fastest mutating region in the mitochondria, which is a gene called the CO1? Now, if this is the fastest region, we should be able to observe its change in real time. So therefore, I made a prediction based on if this particular cat called the suited clouded leopard was on the ark. Now, if that species was, I can't be certain, but something related to that, probably its parent, probably was. And the reason I say that, and I assume that, is because a lot of cats are related to other cats. What you're looking at in the bottom right are all the different tigers. And that's a branching chart based on haplogroups. So we don't see one tiger generating all those other tigers. We're seeing a branch of all the different tigers coming from another cat species. So therefore, we can track cats back somewhat. But again, they have a lot of assumptions built into their phylogenetic one. And I wanted to take those assumptions away by just standing back and looking at mutation rates. So therefore, if we never study cats and we don't go, well, let's look at their divergence time. When will we find it? And nobody ever does a pedigree rate with these cats. So I would love it if they would, because it would validate whether or not this mutation rate is true. But there's another way to test my theory. All we have to do is sit back and wait. Because if this is true, then a new mutation will arise within a particular amount of time. And you can see it right here. Divergence will happen, around 25 to 30 years. Boom, you see another difference arise between species. Within the species will take even longer, because obviously since that time, around 108 nucleotides, substitutions have occurred in the CO1 gene within that region. So my prediction is that if 101 of these substitutions has occurred since the flood within this cat that you're looking at, then when will the next one arise? Well, we can base that based on the generation time, how many have occurred since the flood, and when the next one will arise based on those observable facts. So if it's wrong, the next one won't even happen within cats for another 39,000 years. That's a long time in the evolutionary time frame. I mean, that's like nothing in the evolutionary time frame is what I mean, but that's untestable as well. Mine's within our lifetime. We'll be able to see the differences arise. So we don't have to rely on a pedigree rate ever being done on these cats. Now, I didn't just do cats either. Cats were great because there's a lot of them for me to test. I did it on wolves. I did it on foxes. I did it on bats. I even did it on a couple aquatic species. I did it on humans, and I did it on all primates, and including fruit flies, just for you guys, because fruit flies are tested more than anything else in humanity. So if we're going to see a difference arising in something, it's going to be in fruit flies. So that's how I wanted to conclude it, because I wanted to give the audience and the skeptics something that we should be able to see in real time. And at least if they don't do a pedigree rate ever with the CO1 gene, we should still be able to obtain my results with just sitting on our hands and waiting.
Bam. Home run hit, brother. I got to say, 2 hours and 15 minutes has flown by. But as we always say, when these evolutionists are saying more things wrong in one sentence than letters that are in that sentence, it used to be words, but man, it's getting worse for them. So, yeah, great job. I think we hammered every point necessary, including discussing the bigger picture and many of the other amazing lines of evidence for independent origin. So guys, thanks so much. I hope everybody enjoyed. We managed to have between 30 and 40 people the whole time. So make sure to share around. This is an important stream for people to see. And just looking in the comment section. Yeah. Oh, Otangelo says just subscribe. Yeah, definitely, guys. If you like debates and discussions, we've got, Matt, as you know, we've got almost 1,100 videos uploaded on the channel. So a lot of the old SFT classics in terms of discussions, debates, now they're kind of harder to find. I do have playlists with all of them, though. But we've got the alternative channel, SFT Debates and Interviews. Make sure to subscribe. I'm making sure to upload every day, every other day, old SFT classics. We've got a ton of them. So if you're a debate discussion fanatic like me, you'll be busy for the next million years. So great job, Matt. Another fatal blow to evolutionism. That's for certain, brother. So you've earned yourself some dinner as well. Any last words, my man?
Oh, good. I need to eat.
Yeah, you've earned it. So what's funny is we probably could go for another 2.5 hours because, I'm looking at other things I wrote down based on their video. But I think 2 hours and 16 minutes is enough. And I'm glad everybody enjoyed. Brother Godzilla Freak says, great stream. Montaz, good to see you, brother. Good night, Luca.
All right.
Nita Powell, thank you so much. Of course, our pleasure. So God bless everybody. Last words, Matt, then we'll shut her down.
Sure. How about this for everybody? For
Sure.
subscribing to this guy's channel here, I will give you the mutation rate book in the description. Okay, so it'll just be free link to the document that comes with it. So when this video's over, I'll post it for everybody.
I love it. I'm gonna resubscribe just to get a free copy of that mutation rate book. It's so good. I want to have 100 copies. All right, brother. Good place to end it. So God bless everybody. We got a lot of good shows next week, and especially in February. If you thought January was big, February is going to be bigger. So, guys, God bless. Hope everybody had fun. And Dr. Ramat, we are out.